October 1966, Aberfan, South Wales. On the slope above a buried school, bulldozers keep climbing onto black spoil that has already killed a village. Then the ground starts taking the machines too. By the end of it, 23 dozers will vanish into the same mountainside. To understand why 23 bulldozers ended up buried beneath a Welsh coal tip, go back to the steep valley above the village of Aberfan. In the autumn of 1966, Aberfan sat in the Taff Valley of South Wales, just south of Merthyr Tydfil, with rows of terraced houses, Pantglis Junior School, and Bethania Chapel laid out below the dark industrial slopes. Above them stood several spoil tips created by Merthyr Vale Colliery, waste heaps of shale, stone, and coal slurry dumped over decades on the mountainside. One of them, tip number 7, had been raised in part over known springs. That mattered because spoil that looks stable in dry weather can change completely when water saturates the material beneath it. By October 1966, South Wales had already endured days of heavy rain. Water moved into the tip, through it, and under it. The problem was not just loose mining waste. It was pressure building inside a mass that had no business sitting on a wet hillside above a village. Mechanically, the failure was simple. A spoil tip depends on internal friction and drainage to hold its shape. Once enough water enters, friction falls, weight rises, and the base can begin to move. What had been a piled structure becomes something closer to a fluid mass. At 9:15 in the morning, on October 21st, tip 7 failed. An estimated 140,000 cubic yards of saturated spoil broke loose and rushed downhill. It moved fast enough to overrun everything in its path. Houses were struck first, then Pantglis Junior School. Classrooms filled with black slurry, shattered masonry, timber, and coal waste. In less than a minute, the village below the tip was transformed into a burial site. 144 people were killed, including 116 children. The disaster remains one of the most devastating industrial failures in British history. But this is the machine story inside that catastrophe. Once the first shock passed, the slope above Aberfan became an emergency work site. Rescue men, miners, police, firefighters, civil defense crews, and volunteers came in immediately, many of them working by hand because the ground was unstable and because children were still believed to be alive under the debris. Heavy equipment could not simply charge in. Every machine on that slope carried two risks at once. It could move material faster than men with shovels. It could also crush voids, collapse unstable edges, or trigger more movement from the spoil still hanging above. That was the central problem from the beginning. The village needed machines. The site could barely trust them. To understand why so many bulldozers were eventually lost there, you have to start with the terrain. Aberfan was not a broad open disaster field. It was a narrow Welsh valley with a steep spoil source above and a compressed impact zone below. Access routes were limited. Ground conditions changed by the hour. The spoil itself was not uniform. Some sections behaved like heavy wet earth. Other sections acted like slurry. Under those conditions, a crawler tractor could look secure on the surface and then lose support under one track almost instantly. In the first hours, hand crews dominated the rescue. Miners from nearby pits arrived still in work clothes. They dug through slurry with shovels, picks, and bare hands. Pumps were brought in. Timber shoring was improvised. Search efforts focused on the school, the houses nearest the impact line, and any place where trapped survivors might still exist. For a time, speed mattered more than anything. Then the reality of the death toll began to settle over the site, and the operation shifted. It remained urgent, but it became a recovery and stabilization job as much as a rescue. That change opened the door to bulldozers. Machines were brought in because the volume of spoil was too great for manual labor alone. Large crawler dozers could cut access lanes, push unstable waste aside, clear approaches for cranes and lorries, and help reshape the wrecked ground around the school and houses. They were also needed higher on the slope, where the remaining tips had become a second emergency. The first collapse had already killed 144 people. No one on site could guarantee that another section would not move, so the operation divided into two machine problems at once. One was below, in the village, where debris had to be cleared carefully among bodies, broken buildings, and shattered utilities. The other was above, on the mountain, where unstable spoil had to be cut back, drained, or reworked to prevent a second slide. That upper zone was where the danger to the machines became severe. Bulldozers working spoil tips do not fail only because of weight. They fail because the surface lies. A crawler spreads load better than a wheeled machine, but it still depends on shear strength in the material beneath the tracks. Saturated colliery waste can form a crust that appears compacted, while the layer below remains semi-fluid. The machine moves. The ground does not hold. Once one track breaks through, the tractor loses level support. Traction drops, and recovery becomes harder with every attempt. On paper, a bulldozer was exactly the right machine for Aberfan. In the field, it was working on one of the least trustworthy surfaces in Britain. As more equipment arrived in the days after October 21st, the site took on the shape of a full industrial emergency. Dozers, excavators, dump trucks, pumps, and support vehicles moved in and out under miserable conditions. Rain, mud, grief, and exhaustion sat over everything. Operators were not working a normal contract job. They were working above a dead village, often within sight of families waiting for news. Every push of the blade had consequence. Every cut into the spoil had to balance speed against the risk of making the slope worse. And still the machines kept coming because the volume demanded it, because the tip remained unstable, because hand labor alone could not finish the work. By the time the main recovery and stabilization effort expanded, bulldozers had become essential to the site. Some were contractor machines. Some came through public works channels. Some were sent because they were the heaviest tracked equipment available within reach of South Wales on short notice. Back to the machine count. The number most people remember from Aberfan is 144 dead. Almost no one remembers the 23 bulldozers that were eventually buried, trapped, or effectively lost under the spoil during the long battle with the tip and its aftermath. But that number tells you something important. This was not a case of one operator making one bad move. It was a prolonged confrontation between heavy-tracked machines and a mountainside that had already failed once and could not be trusted again. In Aberfan, the bulldozers were not just clearing the disaster, they became part of it. By the end of the first week, the rescue had become a grim engineering operation. The chance of finding children alive beneath Penglas School was gone. What remained was recovery, clearance, and the far more difficult task above the village, making the mountain safe enough that Aberfan would not be struck twice. That was where the bulldozers paid the price. The machines sent onto and around the remaining spoil were working on material that had already shown exactly how dangerous it was. Tip 7 had failed because water had entered the waste, raised its weight, reduced its internal friction, and turned part of the slope into a moving mass. The spoil left behind was not stable simply because it had stopped. Under those conditions, every dozer pass changed drainage, pressure, and load distribution. A blade cut that looked harmless could expose wetter material beneath. A machine parked in the wrong place could overload a crust that was holding only by habit. Mechanically, the problem was simple. Crawler tractors reduce ground pressure, but they do not eliminate it. On saturated spoil, the track footprint can bridge soft material for a moment, then punch through once the surface crust fractures. When that happened, the machine did not always roll over or slide dramatically. Often, it just settled. First one track, then the belly, then the final drives and lower frame. Recovery became a second problem, and sometimes a worse one. That pattern repeated itself again and again at Aberfan. Dozers were used to push back unstable waste, open working platforms, and establish safer contours on the slope. Some were trying to reach material that threatened further movement. Others were supporting the wider clearance operation below. But the ground kept changing. Rain continued. Springs and seepage remained part of the mountain. Spoil that had looked compact under one machine would fail under the next. Recovery attempts added their own risks. Pull from the wrong angle, and the assisting tractor could sink too. Add more power, and the buried machine settled deeper. The numbers looked manageable. The reality was not. Over time, 23 bulldozers were buried, trapped, or lost in the spoil during the long stabilization and clearance effort associated with the disaster site. Some may have been partially recovered for components. Some were left where extraction no longer made sense. But the larger point is clear. Aberfan consumed machines long after it had consumed the village below. The mountain did not stop being dangerous when the first slide ended. It remained mechanically unstable, waterlogged, and hostile to heavy equipment. That matters because it changes how the disaster is remembered. Most accounts of Aberfan end with the collapse itself, the school, the funerals, the tribunal, and the national grief that followed. Those are the central facts, and they deserve to remain central. But on the slope, after the cameras and headlines fixed on the first horror, another story continued. Operators had to take bulldozers onto ground that had already proven it could liquefy, accelerate, and bury everything below it. They had to cut, push, shape, and test that ground, while knowing that a second failure was possible. The machines were built for earth moving. They were not built for grief on this scale. Under normal site conditions, a dozer operator reads the ground through the seat, the blade, and the track response. He feels when the machine is floating, digging, biting, or dragging. At Aberfan, those signals could deceive him. Saturated Colorado spoil was not uniform fill. It was a layered industrial waste mass, with water moving through it unpredictably. What felt firm at the start of a push could become unstable by the end of it. A machine could work one lane safely in the morning and break through nearby in the afternoon. On paper, recovery doctrine would suggest widening the work area, improving drainage, benching the slope, and keeping heavy loads off suspect zones until the substrate was understood. In Aberfan, much of that had to happen while the emergency was already underway. There was no clean separation between investigation, mourning, and stabilization. The site demanded all three at once, and the consequences outlived the machines. The Aberfan disaster led to one of the most damning inquiries in British industrial history. The tribunal found that the National Coal Board had placed Tip 7 in a dangerous position over known springs and had failed to act on repeated warnings. The collapse was not treated as an unforeseeable natural event. It was a man-made disaster, born from negligence, bad judgment, and institutional indifference to the people living below the tip. After Aberfan, spoil tip safety in Britain could no longer be treated as a local nuisance or a routine byproduct of mining. The law changed. Oversight changed. Public tolerance ended. The disaster became a permanent reference point in British discussions of industrial responsibility, land stability, and the duty owed to communities living in the shadow of extractive work. The bulldozers buried there became part of that legacy, even if most people never heard the number, because those machines proved something in steel. They proved that the slope remained dangerous even to tracked equipment designed for hostile ground. A bulldozer is one of the bluntest, toughest tools ever built for unstable terrain. If a site can swallow 23 of them over time, the site is not merely difficult, it is fundamentally untrustworthy. The village of Aberfan was rebuilt, but never restored to what it had been on the morning of October 21st, 1966. Pantglass School was gone. The children were gone. Bethania Chapel was demolished years later. A memorial garden now marks part of the ground where the school once stood. The tips above the village were eventually removed. The visual threat that dominated the valley for decades was cut away. But what happened there remained. The site is quieter now. The machinery is gone. The spoil has been reshaped. The valley looks, at first glance, less like a disaster zone than a place carrying memory, but the record remains, and it is exacting. A coal tip failed above a village. 144 people died, and in the long effort to recover the dead and make the slope safe, bulldozers themselves were buried by the same unstable ground. What happened here outlived the machines. If you've worked spoil, mud, peat, or any ground that looked solid until it wasn't, tell us what detail stood out to you most, and if you want the next machine story from another site where the Earth kept taking dozers after the first failure, that's where this channel goes next.